Thank you very much. Yeah, so just introductions real quickly for myself, Jason Henson. I'll be leading the panel discussion this morning. Just a quick little background on myself and my career, so we understand how I kind of fit into this conversation. My background, I started as a journalist working for a large veterinary group, so started there as a server network workstation admin. Decided to jump ship from there, go work for the other side, the dark side, my vendor. So that actually led me to a relationship with a telecom group and led two teams, two different products there. If anybody wants to understand the woes of being on call, call me, talk to me. We can discuss those things. But actually, that took me to being a customer first of SolarWinds, and then ended up moving on into employment by SolarWinds from 2005 into 2009. And at that point in time, really wanted to continue my relationship with SolarWinds, and but wanted to really have a different approach and be more invested with the customer. And so that led into the story of where we are today, which is we started Loop One and professional services firm focused on SolarWinds products, but really from a point of purpose. I've over the last 13 and a half years led our various engineering firms or engineering groups, and today I'm focused on our pre-sales team. So we're going to do a round robin of introductions across the rest of the panel here. So Kevin, if you want to make an introduction for yourself.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Klein. You can find me on social media at KE Klein. I've been in the industry since the mid 80s. I started my first big database professional job working for NASA on the life support system in the International Space Station on a very early version of Oracle 5. And they didn't have stored procedures in, they hadn't invented them yet. So I started very early and have worked through the various eras, if you will, with databases. I write a lot, so you may be familiar with some of my books like SQL in a Nutshell. And I serve as the technology evangelist for databases at SolarWinds.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's see. Next on our list, Kurt, if you want to make an introduction for yourself.
I don't know if my background's quite as cool as Kevin's, but I have been in IT for 33 years. My company is DBG Software. The focus the entire time has been on query performance on basically all relational databases. Probably most of our work is in Oracle and SQL Server, and the others to a lesser extent. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. Glad to be talking alongside these panelists, and I'm a little bit excited for our viewers. I think they'll get some good stuff out of this.
John, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Jason. My name is John Sterrett. I'm the founder of Procure SQL. I've been doing data ever since early 2000. Started Procure SQL in 2014, solely focused on performance tuning because that's always been my niche. But today we've grown to kind of cover the four pillars of data, from app dev to data integration between apps to visualizations and analytics, and then data management, aka the performance tuning, which we hope to help share some insights today in this panel.
Yeah, great. John, thank you, Kurt. Everybody, we always talk about the heroes behind the heroes and the brand names that we all are familiar with and how influential they are in the world. These guys are definitely influencing change and betterment in the world. So really, I'm very pleased to have you guys all in the panel today. Our conversation today, we're going to get into a conversation around from a perspective of being a network engineer. Why should I care about the performance between my application and my database? So, you know, as we jump into this conversation, Kurt, I'll start with you. You know, you've worked with these database products for a long time, a number of years. So coming from a database professional background as a consultant, right, specifically from that consultant point of view, I'm certain you've got all kinds of stories. We talked about hero of heroes, right, or behind the heroes. I'm when you are consulting, what gets you engaged in conversations with network engineers just right off the bat?
Yeah, well, first I'll say, unfortunately, it's not nearly frequent enough. I do wish the different areas communicated more, but what typically is happening when we do get together is some high visibility, high pressure situation, usually a SWAT team, if you will. Millions of dollars are being lost by the hour. Customers can't get on a website. Payroll's not completing. These type of issues. And what tends to happen is, we'll all get together. It's kind of a round table. Our laptops are out. We're all sweating. What the heck is going on? And a lot of good comes out of that because I think that it brings the best out in us. I wish it was a little bit more proactive, and I wish it could be not quite as intense of a scenario. And that may just be my experience, but that's how I've seen that interaction uh, typically happen. Um, we'll talk about this probably at some point, but one of the metrics that I always seem to bring up with the networking folks is IO. You know, uh, Going through the system, going through the network, and a lot of times in those discussions, that is not only the focus; it's usually the resolution. So, we come in, tune the queries, slash the IO, hardware goes down, network, you know, utilization goes down, and I just I'm hoping that we can get to a point where it's not always such a high pressure situation.
That's good feedback. John, I mean, you come from a similar background to Kurt, but slightly different perspective.
Yeah,
Do you have
no, I've had a
similar
lot of
different experiences?
Sure. I've had a lot of experiences working with network people in different ways, from the very start of my career working at a law firm to working with some of the best network engineers I have met, to working as a consultant in some scenarios where basically I'm brought in as the bridge because the infrastructure team and the data management or dev team refuse to talk to each other. And I'm kind of the person that's trying to bring everything together. So through all of these scenarios, the one thing I firmly believe in is I think most people come to the table with good intentions, right? People may not be armed with the right data or the right way to present the data, but I still firmly believe a lot of times people have the good intentions. And I think the one thing that's kind of helped me a lot is I let everyone know, like, hey, my goal coming in here isn't to basically say your baby is ugly, right? My goal here is to kind of come in and help the whole team eliminate the pain that everyone is seeing. And, to be quite frank, sometimes it is the database. And those are things that we could talk about. And a lot of times people get excited when they realize someone's stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, we're looking at this. This is the problem. This is how you can see the problem. So hopefully we're not repeating the cycle as time goes on. And to even share one story with working with one of my clients, we were brought in to help them upgrade their 80 terabyte database. And they never had HA before because they just said, the network team said it's impossible, right? This is too big a data, won't fit through the pipe. And I was able to work with them and show them that there's other ways we can seed the data without it all going through your network pipe to start. And that way only the goes through that network pipe. So I think going through scenarios like that where you kind of treat everyone as equals and show that, hey, you're here to just be a helpful resource, not the superstar, goes a long way.
That's interesting. When you guys find yourself in that conversation with either the engineer or the system admin, typically I would expect you're probably first engaging with the database team and then getting introduced to a network engineer or a system admin because they're talking through the solution to the problem. But as you engage with those engineers and at the system or at the application level or at the network level specifically, like this conversation is related to, how do they typically respond? Are they engaged in the conversation? Are they disengaged in the conversation? They feel like it's not my problem. How do they typically respond to you?
Usually up front, there's a little bit of, maybe, I don't know if anxiety is the right word, but it's like, someone's coming to say we're the problem. And I think as soon as we can come in and point out that we're there to help, things always tend to seem to get a lot better for me.
Okay. Kurt,
Yeah,
did you have
I
any?
tend to agree a little bit with John. It's a little bit of not my problem at first, but I think the engagement starts to happen when we start resolving things. query performance isn't something that has to take a long time. Like in a matter of minutes, you can start to affect change, right? I mean, there's aspects of it that do take longer, but sometimes it might be kind of a no-brainer situation. And what I've seen from networking folks is, yeah, you're right. At first, it's a little bit of, hey, get in here. This is your problem. A little bit of finger pointing. But as they're sort of learning, how impactful query performance is on their network, there's a real appreciation, I think, for how the two organizations can get together, resolve issues, and again, I said this before, but not always wait until things are, the sky's falling.
Yeah, for sure. All right, cool. Kevin, question for you. So typically with being Loop One and focusing on consulting IT on the whole, Loop One, whenever we find ourselves in a place where we're talking about database, we've worked our conversation to a point where that's really a focus of that conversation. Typically, there's two products that we're engaging in conversation around. One is going to be our database performance analyzer, DPA, and the other one's going to be SQL Sentry. So my question for you, these are distinctly different products, and how they get used. But can you share a bit about those differences and elaborate a little bit more, maybe even on DPA?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we have a new product as well for database management. So we have the very popular, very well-known DPA, Database Performance Analyzer, and it is broad, but not terribly deep. It goes deeper than most monitoring tools. However, it's focused on weight statistics. So all the major relational database platforms, SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, DB2, Sybase, MySQL, all of those major platforms contain a metric known as weight statistics. And these are broad categories that tell us where the interactions with the database are waiting before they can complete. And so it will reveal all sorts of things like a network bandwidth issue, a saturation issue, sending too much over the line. It might reveal a latency issue, as well as things like memory, CPU, and to Kurt's point, most importantly, it identifies the specific queries that are causing those weight statistics to accrue. So it's a real common thing once you get into database troubleshooting that you want to find the top SQL queries that are causing issues. But sometimes if you just go based on what your users are telling you, you'll have a knee-jerk response that is actually taking you down the wrong path. So, oh, we run this big query every Friday, that must be the problem. When in fact, a variable or parameters change somewhere and you're experiencing not one big monster query, but a death by 1,000 cuts because this other small set of queries that are very small are taking a lot more time than usual. And so in aggregate, they're the problem. So DPA is wonderful for that. It is popular across the board with database management teams, but also with dev teams. So we see a lot of developers using it because SQL is like a second language to them. If you're a developer, your first language might be VB or C# or Python or what have you. So this enables you to be extremely high performance in terms of the quality of your SQL queries. Then we have on the other side, SQL Sentry. And SQL Sentry is not broad. It only focuses on Microsoft SQL Server and Azure SQL, but it is extremely deep. And it gives you more information than any other product on the market by a long shot. For example, it gives you detailed information about your availability groups and high availability failover. It gives you information about NUMA node behavior. Not just the typical kind of things like here's your top 10 most expensive queries. Very deep. And so that product is for customers I'd say in the higher end of sophistication. Not necessarily a huge company, but one that really focuses on SQL Server performance because that is business critical for you. And if that SQL Server goes down, it will cause you to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour. In fact, if a lot of the SaaS companies that we talk to tell us that it's not a matter of crashing a SQL Server anymore, it's a matter of slow. Because for our website, slow is the new down. You know, your customer will say, I've waited 3 seconds, that's enough. And then they'll go on to another website. The third product is a new one called DBO, Database Observability, and it covers NoSQL databases as well as the majority of relational databases, but it's all from a SaaS perspective. So if you are cloud first, entirely in the cloud, and you want a SaaS monitoring product, then DBO is probably the right choice for you.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. It's exciting to hear about the DBO product too. That's a brand new SKU for us, so I'm excited to get to work with that a little bit more. Kurt and John, you both have built practices on these things. Kurt, do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, predominantly it's with DPA. I don't have as much experience with SQL Century, but I've been around the DPA product since 1999 through all its acquisitions and ownerships and name changes. I think that speaks to the value and the currency that that product has in the monitoring space for it to still be here. And it's been with SolarWinds for the longest amount of time it's been in existence. So I feel like it's home, and that's great. So I tend to follow it wherever it goes. I really do like this product. Like Kevin was saying, it doesn't do a deep dive into any of the databases that it monitors. But what's nice about DPA is it's almost like tailor fit for a network admin or a system admin or somebody that doesn't have a strong database background to quickly get a vocabulary on what is happening on the database that's affecting the network. I can only imagine, because I'm not a network person, I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I can only imagine using a network suite like Orion or HCO, and you can tell that there's something going on in the database. Well, one click and you're in DPA, and probably 2 more clicks and you can see what the problem is. And having that info and being able to either do something about it yourself if you're kind of an accidental DBA, or going to another team, or if it's outsourced, but getting straight to root cause on issues is imperative. And a product like DPA makes that extremely simple. So I do like the flexibility of all the different database platforms. It's nice to see a dashboard with Postgres and MySQL and DB2 and Oracle and SQL Server all on the same dashboard. That agility is wonderful. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of that product.
That's awesome. That's good to hear.
And I love both of them. So my career with monitoring tools kind of really started around 2010 when I met Confia, which is now DPA. And I was a developer at this point in time. So I was transitioning into a role where I was focusing on performance tuning, i.e., I was making my crappy code be a little less crappy and run faster. And DPA was amazing for me to get started because, I would see the bars, the top offenders. I know which one of my statements I needed to focus on. And then I would kind of go from there. As my career evolved, though, I've realized that Sentry gives me so many different things, even on the query level itself. So like in DPA, I can go in and I can see, okay, these are the statements I want to focus on real quickly within a few clicks. I can easily tell, is this problem really death by a million cuts? Is it slowly running query? Or is it parameter sniffing? Because per execution, a lot of times I can actually get the parameter values that were used at runtime and see how the metrics for IO, as an example, would change. So both are phenomenal tools. But like I said, I think DPA is really great for someone that's getting started. But as someone kind of furthers their career along in working with data, I kind of find Sentry as the tool that has provided me the most value over time.
That's cool. Okay. I was thinking about this. I had a conversation with a client. It was a working lunch the other day. And we got into this conversation. It was really interesting. It was insightful for me to hear from him because we were sitting over lunch and we were discussing really expanding out his tool set. He was looking at and considering some additional tooling for their organization. He was the administrator for their current tooling. He's also a network admin to begin with, and he's part of that team. They have full tooling. They were just looking at expanding what that is. So we were going through how they're using their current tooling. They were in a place where they were struggling though, and they were struggling with performance of their applications and their network. And as we got to talking further, we started discussing how they had those tools set up and how they were sharing information. And what we found out is that in the spirit of trying to uh, corner the data or corner the answers, they had cornered the insights into those specialties, into those silos. And so what we found out was happening was that information, that data, those insights were not being shared across the rest of the IT stack. Right. So, we have database guys who don't know about, system stuff or network stuff, and, network guys that don't know about what's going on in the database or the system side. Right. And so there just becomes this kind of cornering of information, and that's really what they were experiencing. So, coming out of that, John, Kurt, we've spoken about this scenario actually a couple of times, trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to help this customer or help a customer like this? Because this is not the only conversation I've had like this, where we can help these customers get the most out of their investments. Um, so principally, if we open up, here's what I'd like to understand is from your point of view, if we open up and we share that insight, the data across the specialties, across those silos, how have you seen that help those teams within the customers that you're engaging? So you engage in a customer, and then you start expanding into those silos, having those conversations. How have you seen that start to help those groups?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think if we accomplish anything here today, it's to open up that communication more between these different teams. Earlier, I mentioned that a lot of the scenarios I'm in are in SWAT team kind of scenarios. Um, and, I can't imagine there's a C-suite anywhere that wants to feel like they've spent tons of money on software, third-party software, monitoring software, just for us all not to be communicating. We need to do that. A story that comes to mind for me is we had I was at a customer site, and there was performance issues, and it was actually the network team that brought it to our attention on the database side, that they felt like something was not efficient within the rack. This is Oracle I'm talking about, within the rack setup. So we opened up DPA, and in DPA at the rack level, there's a metric called rack overhead. Now, it doesn't terribly define what that means, but we were able to, using DPA, find what queries were taking the largest footprint. And we addressed those queries, and guess what? Rack overhead all but disappeared. I mean, it went from like 50 or 60% of the total weight down to under 10%. And so the networking team was like in such appreciation that how quickly query performance can affect something called rack overhead. Now, to them, they didn't know that metric was called that, right? They didn't have access to DPA. And I think if we can start to look at each other's products, we don't have to be experts in them, and we don't have to have the entire vocabulary of the other team, but just enough to take a peek into the other team's product. And if we can see that, I mean, we're all busy, right? So we may not be catching all of the alerts or all of the issues that are going on, but somebody is. And so, yeah, that story comes to mind because it was a real eye opener that we can get together and start solving issues that help each other.
And from my perspective, one of the big things I think about is recovery time objective, right? And this starts at the very beginning of how long it takes to even identify a problem. You can't solve a problem if you're not able to identify it. So I'm a big believer of giving full transparency, read access, make the tools available to anyone who wants to go in and look, because it'll help them with their learning path as well if they're interested in learning more. about data and managing the data and the performance of the data. I mean, at Procure SQL, I think one of our big core values is we like to teach how to fish. We like to actually share our knowledge with people. Many of us speak at conferences, and we constantly are helping customers by training them and growing their knowledge with their own data. And by doing that, I think that helps the whole team be able to reduce that time it takes to identify problems so we can actually get started on resolving them.
Mhm.
So if you're not able to work together, like I strongly believe, same as Kurt, that in order to be successful, you got to be willing to be able to work together, because that will help you reduce that time to determine what the incident really is so you can go through and fix it quicker.
Man, listening to you guys talk, my head starts swimming because this is so fundamental to what I think SolarWinds and what Loop One are trying to do. If you look at the way that the products come together, or the way we pair things, um, that's the sharing of that information, trying to create insights. Because bottom line is, we're trying to resolve these problems. We're trying to stay ahead of the curve, trying to stay ahead of the problem. You know, it's so fundamental. Loop One has Loop One monitoring maturity model, right? This is a maturity model that we built for that just comes out of the thinking that came from years and years of experience of consulting all types of customers. For instance, we were talking about NASA and Kevin's background a little bit earlier. Companies like that, where we might be consulting and we bring a lot of the insights from those experiences together, and we start talking about how do we curb those together to create that experience. And so, anyways, it's really, really fun and exciting to hear you talk about that, Kurt and John.
Jason, if I could interject as well.
Yeah.
I started as a database administrator at a time when there weren't a lot of tools. And that's part of the reason I went into the tools business, by the way, because I was so frustrated by not having things that would help me solve problems. And one of the things I learned, of course, very early on was that if you're managing your environment based on how much the phone rings, you're doing it wrong, right? A lot of small shops today still have no monitoring. And so I'm a big fan of maturity models, and yours is an excellent one. If you don't have our tools, please use some kind of monitoring tool. Even just the monitoring features that are built into Windows, or if you're running Oracle on Linux or something like that, it's essential. Being notified before your end users start blowing up your phone is one of the first steps to having a mature management process, because you can get in there and fix the problem, perhaps before the end users even notice.
Yeah.
And that raises your credibility, because admins, no matter what part of the IT infrastructure you manage, we're kind of like plumbers. If things are going great, no one gives us a thought. But if things go bad, we are the first person they call. They'll blow up
Yeah.
their phone and make our lives miserable. And we don't want that. And we don't want that for them. So we're already kind of in professionally, I use the term a credibility deficit. People are like, oh, whenever I see the IT guy coming through our office, I get worried. We don't want that. We want them to be thinking of us as the problem solvers.
Yeah.
And the people who get things done. And so that's a key thing to do. May not be our tools, even though they're the best tools, but you need to use some kind of tool to stay on top of that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think educated conversations, right? Nobody wants to have somebody just come and say, "Hey, I have a problem. Fix my problem. Fix my problem." You come with a solution first, or you come with some kind of an insight. So you have that educated conversation that allows you to team up and pair with your specialties and your experiences, so that you can be so much more excellent at the end result, right? So it comes down to the bottom line at the end of the day, and that experience that we're trying to focus on for the customer. That's really good stuff. We've gotten into some recent conversations around IO. And so uh, when we think about ourselves, it's funny because I've made so many uh, uh, postings for job requisites for network engineers, and I cannot think of a single one where there has been a responsibility of that person to really have an understanding of IO. And how that relates to the network. That's just never been in the language. So if we think about ourselves as a network engineer, and what the question I think I have for this group is, why is that important? I've never seen it in a listing. I've never seen it be a part of a job description. Um, maybe just Kurt, can you help us make a connection to that? Why I think a really important question for us to understand is why should a network engineer care about IO?
Well, yeah, the reason that a network engineer should care about IO is probably best addressed by laying a few facts out, and I'll lay these out in a certain order. And I'll start with an analogy, and I don't know if this is a good one or not, but if you think about the network in an IT organization, it's connecting all different types of hardware. Okay, well, so is our vascular system in our own bodies, organs, throughout the whole body. We have metrics that we want to keep an eye on, like our blood sugar, our cholesterol. Okay, if a doctor says, hey, you got high cholesterol, are you going to depend on somebody else to resolve that for you? No, you probably have a sense of ownership over that. Well, in a network discussion, I don't think it should be any different. We're all in the same team. We all have the same objective, and we can all easily agree that I/O is one of the largest issues that happen on a network. The top goal of query tuning is to lower I/O. Now, there's some situations where you want higher I/O. If you've got partition tables and you want to take advantage of I/O parallelism, or if you have a technology like Oracle Exadata, you might want to have higher I/O in exchange for a lower runtime. Those situations exist. But by and large, what we're trying to do is touch as few blocks as possible to get the rows that we need. Now, typically this falls on the DBA, right? I don't know that this was the best IT decision in the history of IT. It's a very busy job role. To try to tackle hundreds or thousands of queries on a daily basis probably isn't at the top of a DBA's mind. So I think if a network admin starts to realize that, hey, I've got IO coursing through the veins of my network that's in all likelihood unhealthy, an unhealthy amount of it, and the job role that's typically responsible for lowering that IO is so busy, doing other things that they may not be able to keep on top of that, then I'm going to take it upon myself to maybe get a little more vocabulary about lowering that IO. So, I'll even take it a step further and say that the database vendors um, don't do a phenomenal job in their education curriculum about query performance. They're not really selling us queries, they're selling us databases. So you'll see weeks of classes on how to tune the database, but not necessarily as much on tuning queries. So I think that, and what about database vendors and hardware vendors and software vendors? If queries don't run well, then there's more licenses that get sold there. And I don't know that that's intentional, but it's just a byproduct of poorly running queries. So I think that if a network engineer can put all that together and kind of say to themselves, hey, it seems like one of the most opportunity rich areas of IT is query performance. Um, I want to learn more about that, because if I don't, it's somewhat damaging. I'm going to overlook it, and I want to understand it better so I can make this a real gold mine of returns. And I don't know. I think that's why you should be interested, and I think that's why you should care. Not just depend on somebody else to take care of what's going on in your network, and not blindly rely on another area. Get involved, get that discussion started.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I would agree with Kurt's analogy there. I think it's a great one. I mean, one I would add is I'm someone who loves hip hop music, and I would like to think one of my favorite artists, if he worked in IT, would have a song called More Data, More Problems. And the reason why is I've never really worked with many databases where the data gets smaller as time goes. It's always extremely the opposite. And I've seen tons of applications, whether they're a third-party app or even ones I built many years ago, that performed great when no one was using the system. But as data started to become a huge performance bottleneck. So from a network admin side, one thing I would say that you could definitely do to add a lot of value here is as you're benchmarking and monitoring your network utilization and latency, when you see a SQL server or any database server where you're starting to see the benchmark trend and a not so great direction, that's probably a great time to go talk to a DBA or someone involved with the data engineering or architecture to see if we can find opportunities to where we can reduce IO, because not only is it going to make your network bandwidth better, but it'll also help reduce the runtimes and CPU use usually as well with those queries. And another great point to mention here is as we're moving to the cloud, it's a lot easier to spin up more compute power, and that costs a lot more money. We're going in there and being able to find some of these situations where we're using more IO and tuning them not only can help your bandwidth, but also help you save a lot of money as well.
Yeah, if I could just put a punctuation mark on that, we work with a lot of customers who are in undergoing digital transformation, moving to the cloud. And, when we buy equipment for our on-premises data center, we buy for the peak load. But when we move to the cloud, uh, we are able to, tinker with that because you have that elasticity. So if you're busy in certain parts of the year, you could crank up the memory, CPU, and so forth, and then crank it back down after your busy period subsides. But another thing I encourage our customers is that don't forget, you pay by the amount of CPU you consume. You pay by the amount of storage and IOPS you consume on both Azure and AWS. And so if you write poorly constructed queries, they will consume more of all of those. And so it's when moving to the cloud is a very good time to take a look and at least tune up the worst performing of your various queries.
Yeah, there's a fiscal responsibility there, right? So that's interesting. John, thinking about what you were just sharing there, right? I think it's interesting, and I think it's important to call out before you found yourself in your current focus in your career, you were doing some development work prior to that, right? So you were that guy.
Yep.
Um, we've had some conversations, Kurt, you and I most recently, about not just custom applications, but third-party applications. And anymore now, I think you guys do find yourself working on some of those custom applications, but many times, if not most of the time, you find yourself working on third-party applications. So I'd like to hear maybe a little bit about, from your point of view, you know, how does that impact you? How are you engaging in those third-party applications? We're talking about IO. How are you making a difference there?
Yeah, so much of what we work on a daily basis is third-party applications. Very little is in-house developed anymore. So, yeah, no, this is a very common routine. Our customers, and rightly so, they feel like they spend a lot of money on third-party software. They expect it to run well, um, and a lot of times it just doesn't. I don't know why the performance testing or benchmarking doesn't appear to be done by a lot of these third-party applications, but it just isn't there. So they're left in a position of paying another third party like us to come in and help out, uh, make it run like rockets, right? And then what ends up happening then is they get upset with their parent vendor, like, why did we have to pay another company to come in and do this, for you guys? And that all sounds tense, right? And actually, believe it or not, sometimes a third-party software vendor will tell their customer, "You can't change the database. Do not change our code, or you'll void your warranty." Talk about being over a barrel. But this is all easily mitigated when we go to that. So I like being the bridge to that parent vendor and say, look, yes, your customer did commission us to come in and make this run better. However, you probably need it for all your customers. Roll it out, make a patch out of it, include it in the next upgrade. And maybe with the customer that we worked with, maybe have a little barter with them on their maintenance. I've seen that happen quite a bit, believe it or not. So it's just, it feels good to not only help the customer, but also know that, you know, that we're having an impact on a larger scale. So yeah, we work in that dynamic all the time. We actually thrive in it. You know, another concern that customers give us sometimes is, well, you know, we can't change the code. It's either dynamically generated or I can't get to it easily. And that's okay, because believe it or not, there are a lot of topics related to indexing that I don't think are common knowledge. I mean, we all kind of understand a random lookup. You know, you need an index to look a social security number up or something that's a thumbprint. But sequentially organized indexes isn't really a common thing. And so I would say that's the biggest void I see in third-party software, are these composite indexes that are ordered properly based on how the query needs to access those columns. And that doesn't touch the code. It's a database implementation, much like a plan guide, or much like and that runs in SQL Server, or a profile that might run in Oracle. These are ways for us to inject query hints into the query without touching the query. So, and again, we're not touching the code in that fashion. Sometimes we do have to change the code. It's not very common, but yeah, third-party applications are pervasive, and you just have to change your strategy a little bit, dial in the methodology, so that you're not having to change the code, and then work with that parent vendor, and you'll have a patch out soon with those fixes.
If I could interject a little joke I make with a lot of my customers who I've gotten to know well, is that if you're assessing a buy versus build situation and you decide to go the build route, and so now you're assessing multiple candidates, if one of the or multiple of the candidates say, we run equally well on Oracle, on Postgres, on SQL Server, on, you know, et cetera, beware, because they probably run equally crappy on all of those, if I can use that word. The idea being, most development teams have functional requirements. Here's what I need this report, this information to display, but they don't have performance requirements built in there. So they have the functional requirements, but not the performance ones. So it doesn't have a something that says this report has to return information within 5 seconds. And so what we find is the bar for that particular application is, does it do what it says it's going to do? Yes or no. And it's just binary, not is it fast or is it really slow? And so this is a real common problem with purchasing third-party apps, is that database techniques like Kurt, you were talking about properly tuning an index. Can't tell you how many third-party database I've seen in a database application that have no indexes. So it's really something you need to assess as part of your product purchasing workflow.
Add on to Kevin there too. I think another thing I like to advise people is also, when they're working with a vendor, especially if they're picking between one or many vendors, is get a good guidance from the vendor on how things should be configured based on the amount of users or the amount of data growth that is expected. Because if vendors don't have that documented, I tend to find more performance problems with them as well. And to kind of echo off of one thing that Kurt mentioned, that one thing at Procure SQL we've had success to is working with customers to help save them money after the fact. There's been many times where we've gone in, and whether it's just adding an index or rewriting some code a little bit differently, where the vendor gets huge benefits of that. Our customer has been able to use that as a negotiating point to kind of help with their maintenance support or upgrade to new versions, and the total cost of ownership of that commitment with the vendor as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to create a little bit of empathy for the third party vendor. We were talking the other day about, well, we were speaking specifically about Epic and a couple of HR applications that we've all interfaced with in the past as well across our careers in consulting. You know, I've never read a release note where we haven't both addressed fixes and features. And you know, our worst enemy, obviously, it's especially when you're trying to be a creative, is time, right? That's always what we're working against. So I think we have to understand too. I mean, I do believe that these vendors are working hard, and I think it's important to look at them as partners as opposed to, hey, it's me versus them, right? Um, so you know, I think it's important to raise our findings, and just like we would think about it internally to our IT stack and you know to our own team, we can also share share that information. Sure, it can become an asset when we go to do things like you know engaging in conversations with those vendors. But yeah, I think I think that empathy kind of and understanding really makes sense to keep in mind at the forefront of our conversations. Um, Kevin, Kurt, you were going to say something. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay, sorry. Um, Kevin, as a network engineer across my career, thinking back on my telecom days specifically, we had a fiscal responsibility. We were talking about that a little bit earlier with some of the licensing things, but my team had a fiscal responsibility, but we, you know, to all of our spend. We also had to address capacity by purchasing upgrades and adding to the network in order to keep up with the demands. Whatever we bought, we were basically reselling. We're splitting it up, dividing it, and reselling it to our customer base. How would we use a tool to understand if the issue that we were seeing was one that really important to me with integrity? I can say I need to spend money on that upgrade to the network or hardware, or alternately, could the problem be resolved simply by tuning that relationship between the application and the database?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, and it's one I experienced early in my career, back in the 90s, as a DBA at a really big, one of the big four consulting firms, consulting and accounting firms in the internal database team. We we would ask for upgrades. We'd ask for better infrastructure, and one of the things I learned during that era was it puts you in a much more powerful position to make requests like that have a a fiscal impact when you have strong empirical evidence. You know, you have a report you can print out that says, here's what performance has been like for the last year. We see a trend. So look at this trend line here. And you know, when you're not prepared for that, you can't go back in time and pull that information out of nothing. You have to have had the monitoring system in place beforehand to make that happen. And so that's part of the reason why our tools keep years of performance information for you, so you can see those trends. We also have built in, based on that experience, some other kinds of capabilities that help you remain a high integrity reporter to whoever owns the budget, that that need is real. The first is that SQL Century, for example, has a benchmarking capability. So you could say from this time to this time last month, or let's say you're an accounting firm, a local accounting firm, and your busy season is after Christmas all the way through, actually a little bit after April 15th in the United States, which is tax day. Well, you could choose that period of time, your peak time, as your benchmark. And so then you would know anytime you go outside of those normal times. Because if you don't know what normal is, how will you know what is truly abnormal performance? And with that thought in mind, DPA has some AI in it that will show abnormal queries and things that are unusual for a given period of time. So knowing what's normal and abnormal is extremely important to being able to build realistic budgets and make realistic requests. The other thing that we do provide in SQL Century It's currently storage, but it will eventually include the other main components of computing, a CPU, I/O, memory, is forecasting. So we have a couple different machine learning algorithms we use, linear regression, Bayesian kind of forecasting. And so it'll project into the future how much storage you will likely consume with a margin of certainty. So it could say within this 3 percentage point above and below, this is how much you'll need to add 100 gigabytes to this particular database within the next 12 months. So that is another way that you can be very certain. You have a high degree of certainty and a high degree of integrity in when and what to ask for.
That's great. And I was thinking about, SolarWinds and the product set, and DPA now is included in that HCO, that hybrid cloud observability product. You have a small license there to help with that story, to enable, right? So just to the same points we've been discussing in this conversation, was that, I'm making some assumptions there, but I'm assuming that was the thinking there.
Yes, indeed. The the licenses for these server monitoring products are based on the number of instances you're monitoring, not the number of clients you're using. And so if you have DPA monitoring your HCO instance, now you can tell how busy it is, and you can get familiar with this interface that is usable by many different people in the organization at no extra cost. So your network admins could use DPA to take a look and see if network weight statistics are at the top of the pack. And if so, they would know instantly that that is an issue for them to look at. You could see also I/O latencies, which Kurt has very accurately pointed out is usually the root cause for 60% of the issues. So other members of the team get that visibility, just like you had brought up earlier about whether teams should silo and hold their data close, their monitoring information close, or whether it should be open. And so part of the idea there is absolutely it should be open.
Cool. John and Kurt, you guys have both built successful practices. You're consulting lots of really great customers, and influential customers. I think that's really important to call out. Why did you two, and you were focused on these product sets before we ever met and had been for years. Why did you decide to anchor into these products? What was your reasoning there?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it just goes back to my long history with DPA. I might as well have it tattooed on my hand. I don't have any tattoos, but that'll probably
I
be my
want to
first
see
one.
that.
um, no, it's extensive. My experience with that product, and it's saved me. It's saved my customers in countless situations on various database platforms. I can't say enough about it. So, but at the end of the day, it's a diagnostic tool, and to a lesser extent, a remediation tool. So I feel like there's a great partnership, with me and my team and with that product, and we're both kind of on the same journey, if you will. And I think where the baton can get handed off a bit from the product to what we do, or what your database team might do, or what a accidental DBA might do as a network admin, makes a lot of sense. So I feel like it's a real like hand in glove relationship, and yeah, I'm in for the long haul.
For me at Procure SQL, I think there's kind of two main reasons why I like using both tools. One is as an MSP, one way how I think we're different from a lot of MSPs is we try to constantly add value. Like our goal isn't same break fix for same value. We need to have baselines that are established and a track record of us constantly showing those baselines improving. And so both those tools do a phenomenal job of doing that for you. The second one is whenever an incident does occur, I mean, from my experience, I think the majority of the time is spent trying to actually find what the problem is. And so if you really want to reduce that time to bringing everything back to a stable state, you got to be able to identify the problem quickly. And I think both those tools have been a phenomenal job. When I first started, I used to think the best way is do it all from scratch, capture all the traces, slice all the data yourself. It didn't take me long to realize that just doing that alone wasted so much time, where these tools can get you straight to that top offender almost instantaneously.
That's great. Guys, really great conversation. Super challenging. We do have, let's see here. We do have some conversations, some questions here. I'm going to try to get through with just the last few minutes. Let me get over here to be able to take a look at those. There we go. Turn off our polling. Okay, so question for the group here, and I cannot tell if everybody on this is going to be able to see these questions and the answers, the responses, but thank you, Kevin. I see you responding to some of this. But question number one that we have is we use DPA within our organization. Pretty insightful tool. Throwing out this question. Most of the software that we utilize are off the shelf that will have its ORM generating queries when pulling data. How do we optimize queries, being that the software is third party and is already compiled? So I think we started talking about that a little bit earlier, but if anybody wants to expand on that.
I'll jump in.
Oh, I'm
On a
sorry.
daily basis, we kind of deal with that situation. So what you're going to look at from a query perspective is you need to look at the plan, right? There's a point where you can look at metrics for some hallmark red flags, but the very next thing you have to do is tune that plan. It's got a join sequence, it's going to have a join method, and it's going to have access methods. Okay. What DPA will somewhat remediate for you is the access method. Are you using an index or not? If you are, is it the right index? You still have to look at the join sequence and the join method. You can do so much without having to touch the code, even though it's dynamic, through indexing and through query hint injection. And like I mentioned earlier, you can do that with plan guides in SQL Server, and you can do this with profiles or baselines in Oracle.
And I
One
would
thing
even add with,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, Kevin. I was going to say, I'd even add with SQL Server, as the versions become more modern, I think there's a lot that's been added to help automate some of that pain and even make it a lot easier. So back in the day, like a plan guide would be something you'd have to force with XML, and it could be pretty hard to get right. I've failed many times at it when I first started, where with Query Store now you can kind of see the plans in there and lock the best one in, and it becomes a lot easier for IT pros to be able to go in and lock in the right plans and do some of those low weight changes that don't affect the code of the application.
One other thing I would add is it's important to know which ORM. So you can see in the Q&A I asked, is this
Yes.
entity framework or a different one? All of the popular ORMs have strengths and weaknesses. And so, and it also varies over versions. So one thing that we see a lot with, let's say, in Hibernate, is in Hibernate makes very, very bad choices for data types. And so within SQL Server, if you don't use the right kind of data types, say in your stored procedure versus your table, very simple data types like varchar, variable character, and invarchar, which is the Unicode version of that, they are not directly compatible, even though they both have the word varchar in the data type metadata. And so that causes your queries to experience what an anti-pattern called implicit conversion. So some ORMs are known to do that very consistently, whereas others don't have that problem, and maybe they have some other problem. Entity Framework, for example, had a lot more issues in earlier versions, and now in our more recent versions are much more savvy about SQL Server and that sort of thing. So pay attention to the kind of the brand of ORM you're using, and then look to the bloggers who really keep up with that stuff. There are several bloggers who regularly report whenever there's a new release of different kinds of ORMs, things to watch out for when interfacing with your database.
Yeah, and to
Right.
add on to that, Kevin, too, I mean, even with modern versions of Entity Framework, I tend to see a lot of cases where you're joining lots of tables, doing aggregates, where it builds really nasty long queries that could easily be rewritten. If anyone was looking for ORMs, I would recommend one that's more friendly towards actually having full control over building your code, like Dapper. We've worked with some customers, and by all means, we would never say throw this all away and start over, but as you're monitoring, maybe find some of those top offending statements and use those as your proof of concept to move that over to a framework where you can tightly build a stored procedure that would give you ORM mapping as well, or build your T-SQL statements as well.
And then, as Kurt has mentioned earlier, with these tools, you can see what the top SQL statements are. Take those back to the vendor and either say, you wrote this, and we can prove that this is very bad SQL code. You need to fix it. Or, as Curtis said, you can say, hey, we fixed this. Will you integrate this into the product? And as John had said, maybe even, knock off a little on our maintenance because we're making your product better. So yeah, just the idea is that monitoring with empirical metrics is going to enable you to win a lot more discussions than if you don't have that information.
All right. We have one more question, and then I think our time is up after we address this last one here. So, Helen, thank you for pasting this one through. With more systems running in a cloud, does DPA have an ability to align a database IOPS with corresponding cloud tier IOPS limits?
Well, in both cases, SQL Century and DPA, you can see what the overall metric is for your IOPS, what your needs are. And then there are tools from the different vendors from Azure and from AWS that will tell you what tier works best for those needs. So we don't have a direct interface in that way. Although in SQL Century, we do have a stored procedure that will make a recommendation, but it's not part of the regular product. So you'd call support. They'll give you that stored procedure, and then it will extract all the information you need. Look at the Microsoft Azure website and report back to you. But we don't have that yet in AWS, and we don't have that yet in DPA.
All right.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think one thing you could do as part of that migration, though, you could always replay your workloads. So if you have a monitoring solution in place, you can baseline, what performance is today on premises, and then replay that out in the cloud, and then see if you're getting the same performance expectations from your tier, and adjust and redo the replay as needed to make sure that your users have the same experience regardless of being in the cloud or being on premises.
Great. All right, gentlemen, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure.
To be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Thank
panelists.
you, everyone. Thank you, Jason,
Thank
for
you.
leading the discussion today. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. I do appreciate we run a few minutes over. Thank you, Kevin, Kurt, John, for your participation as well. Great discussions, great participation from the audience. I will be sharing the recording, hopefully within the next 48 hours, and some other resources as well, particularly around DPA, database observability, and SQL Century. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us. If you can, one final reminder, just complete the feedback survey as you leave today.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
all.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.